What gets really interesting, and this is something most scientists don't even know about yet, is level 3, the deep layer of aging. There's actually a DNA clock that tells our bodies how old we are. I could take your blood, read it, and roughly predict when you're going to die. Everyone, welcome to Health Theory. Today's guest is David Sinclair, an acclaimed Harvard professor doing some of the world's most groundbreaking work on human longevity. He was named by Time magazine as one of the most influential people on the planet, and his new book, Lifespan, The Revolutionary Science of Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to is set to permanently shift how we think about the inevitability of aging and possibly even death. That is exactly where I want to start. This is my favorite topic. I want to live forever. I make no bones about it. I know that right now, though, I'm on a collision course with death. You have a really interesting theory about what makes us age, which, if I'm not mistaken, you call the information theory of aging. So what exactly is the information theory of aging, and how do we take advantage of it? Aging has been studied for about 5,000 years or more, and just in the last 20 years, we've developed a set of hallmarks of aging, about 8 of them. Many of your viewers will be familiar with telomere attrition, where the ends of chromosomes get shorter, and mitochondrial dysfunction, where the power packs of cells run out of energy as we age. There's a long list of these hallmarks, and most people in my field have said, okay, we've figured out aging. We've got this list, put it in a nice pie chart, and that's it. But what I'm saying is that it's not enough just to tick off what happens, you have to understand if there's an upstream cause for all of this. In my book and in the scientific papers we are now publishing for the scientific community to read, we propose that our bodies are losing essential information as we get older, which drives many, if not all, of these hallmarks of aging. So, how is the epigenome involved in this? How are we losing the information? Give people a quick overview of the difference between genetics, which I think they understand, and the epigenome and epigenetics, and how that plays out. It's not that complicated. There are really just 2 main types of information in our body that we get from our parents. The first is genetic. We all know about DNA and the 4 letters A, T, C, and G. It's a long molecule in the cell, a string of letters that's digital, much like the music on a DVD. But there's another level of information above that in the cells called the epigenome. This is different because it's analog information. In the same way that records and cassette tapes were terrible at storing information, the epigenome controls which genes in the string of DNA are turned on and off. This is why you can imagine DNA sequences as repeating the ATCG code, but the epigenome is the way that the DNA is organized. DNA isn't just flailing around like a string, it's actually packaged around proteins called histones. It's like spooling a hose in the garden. You loop it around and then you can put those loops into bigger structures, creating a chromosome. This chromatin structure is the epigenome. When the hose is tightly spooled, genes are compacted and turned off. When the cell needs to read specific genes, like those in nerve cells or liver cells, it opens those genes up so they can be read. This is an analog system because it varies all the time. It changes based on what you eat, when you wake up, etc. It literally involves the amount of DNA that is unspooled and the places where it is unspooled so it can be read. That determines the cell's function and identity. When we are born, we have 26 billion cells, and each one knows what it is and what it has to be 80 years later. Over time, cells lose their packaging, eventually losing their identity. This leads to diseases, senescence, and organ failure. Until recently, we didn't know why this was happening. So, why is it happening? The packaging is crucial because, much like how software runs code, the epigenome controls which genes are on and off. If you stress the system, biologically stress a cell, the biggest stress you can cause is to break its chromosome. The cell has to halt its functions to repair the DNA. During this process, it takes proteins from elsewhere, which were keeping the cell functioning correctly, to repair the DNA. This unpacking and repacking of DNA may lead to cells losing their youthful gene expression patterns. Proteins, as you've described, are not just powders but rather dynamic machines. They move and perform actions. For example, certain enzymes like sirtuins, which help package and repair DNA, act like tiny scissors. They clip acetyls from proteins involved in DNA packaging. If these enzymes become less active due to damage or stress, the DNA packaging loosens, leading to aging. We've discovered ways to make these enzymes more active through exercise, dieting, and other methods. Instead of the enzyme working slowly, you can boost its efficiency, helping the body stay younger for longer. From a lifestyle perspective, what are we doing that speeds up aging, and what can we do to slow it down or reverse it? I've been studying these sirtuins for about 25 years. We've learned that they respond to the cellular environment. There's a chemical called NAD, which fuels these enzymes. Another molecule, such as resveratrol from red wine, can accelerate their activity. Together, they keep the body younger. Studies in animals and fungi show that these methods, including exercise and dieting, can enhance enzyme activity and improve health. Proteins are largely involved in responding when organisms are under threat. So how do you make the body feel like it's under threat or adversity? One way is to exercise a lot or at least become out of breath a few times a week. Your body will think, "Oh man, we had to outpace one of those saber-toothed cats again. Time to build up the body." Another way is to be hungry, either a couple of times a week or every day. For example, skip a meal or two, and your body will turn on these sirtuins and make more of the fuel NAD for the enzymes. We think this is partly responsible for the health benefits of those lifestyle choices. One thing you talk about that I found really interesting is the notion that what may be good for you when you are young might come back to bite you later in life. This concept of hormesis, that a little bit of stress can be extraordinarily beneficial, is exactly what you are describing. You mentioned getting out of breath and other stressors. When the information started pouring out that the only thing across every known living organism that extends lifespan is eating less, which you discuss in your book, it seemed like you were suggesting that eating less is key. But now, I hear you saying that stressing the system is important. Won't this stress, like running from a lion or being hungry, eventually become problematic? Actually, if you step on a snail, it will die, so there are certain amounts of stress you want to avoid. What you want to do is induce a mild level of stress that prepares the body for adversity in the future, without causing lasting damage or unspooling the DNA, which could lead to disease and eventually death. You don't want to overdo it. Being a little puffed or a little hungry is fine, but starvation and malnutrition will not extend your lifespan. It's a fine line. What we've learned from many animal studies and increasing numbers of clinical trials in humans is that you want to alternate between stress and recovery. We used to keep animals hungry all their lives, and it worked, but it actually works better if you let them recover. Let's dive into that. In the past, animals were denied something like 20 to 30% of their caloric intake for long periods of time, and this extended their life by around 30%. But you are saying that if their caloric intake is roughly the same as animals allowed to eat until satiated, but done in a pulsed pattern of hunger and overfeeding, they actually achieve similar benefits? Let's be clear, nobody knows the perfect diet, and fasting studies are largely based on rodent research. What I can tell you about rodent studies, which I'm very familiar with, is that if you reduce a rodent's calories by 25% for its whole life, it will live longer, around 30% longer. However, the rodent will be really miserable and aggressive. The same is true for humans. I've tried calorie restriction for about a week and found it quite unpleasant. What my colleagues discovered is that it's not just what you eat but when you eat that matters. Studies show that if you create a period of hunger in a mouse, by feeding it every other day, for example, then it can gorge itself on the non-fasting days. This approach, where the mouse eats about 90% of what a mouse with free access to food would eat, results in the same longevity benefits as a constantly hungry mouse. For us, this means we can enjoy life as long as we experience periods of hunger, perhaps once a day or a couple of times a week. You mentioned that what is beneficial when you are young can come back to bite you when you are older. This concept is called antagonistic pleiotropy. It suggests that we evolved to stay healthy and fit until about age 40 because, historically, that's when natural selection started to decline. The forces of natural selection became less effective as we aged, especially after we had reproduced. Building a body that lasts 1,000 years would have been pointless in the evolutionary context. Most species only live long enough to reproduce and then a bit longer. For instance, mice, which can die within 2 years, have bodies built to last 2 years. Whales, which have fewer predators, can live a couple of 100 years. They have evolved to have longer lifespans due to their lack of natural threats. Why do whales live for a couple of 100 years? Certainly, at some point in our past, humans became apex predators, which helped us survive. However, we weren't always at the top of the food chain. We were often at the middle, and many men didn't live past 40 due to starvation or conflict. As we've become apex predators and have reduced external threats, the maximum human lifespan has increased. If evolution continues, we could potentially evolve to live for 200 years. Whales have been at the apex of their ecosystem for about 30 million years, allowing them to evolve long lifespans. Humans share many genes with whales, which are warm-blooded, produce milk, and are conscious, basically, us in the sea. Now, let's talk about resetting the biological clock. How can we do that? What are the mechanisms involved? Obviously, going hungry occasionally and exercising will help, but I know you have a regimen of drugs or precursors that can assist in this process. What can we do to reset the biological clock? There are different levels to resetting aging. The first level is relatively easy to manipulate. These are the proteins that turn genes on and off quickly, known as transcription factors. These can be influenced by diet and exercise. The second level is a bit more complex. It involves not just turning genes on and off but actually silencing them for an extended period. This is where the sirtuins, the enzymes I work on, come into play. These enzymes clip acetals off packaging proteins, which keeps genes silenced longer. To achieve this, you can exercise, diet, and potentially use additional supplements. The third level, which is the deep layer of aging, involves resetting the DNA clock. This clock tells us how old we are biologically. We can take a blood sample and, using it, predict roughly when someone will die. This is based on chemical modifications to DNA, known as methylation, which occur predictably with age. We can measure these modifications to determine biological age. So, if you took my blood right now, we'd look for these methylation patterns. Methylation involves chemical groups, such as hydrogen and oxygen, binding to DNA. These modifications accumulate in predictable ways as you age. By comparing your DNA to thousands of others and their health data, we can estimate your biological age and potential lifespan. Level 1 is about diet and exercise. Level 2 involves using supplements like metformin. Metformin is commonly prescribed to diabetics to regulate blood sugar, but it's now being explored for its potential to influence aging in non-diabetic individuals. There are 3 main pathways that regulate aging: the sirtuins, mTOR, and another pathway related to insulin signaling. Metformin impacts these pathways and may help extend lifespan by mimicking some effects of calorie restriction. When the body has fewer amino acids available, it goes into a protective mode. This is where the third pathway, AMPK, comes in. AMPK is an energy sensor in the body. When energy levels are low, AMPK helps the body hunker down and protect itself from diseases. One of the key reasons AMPK is noteworthy is because it is a target of the drug metformin. Metformin activates the AMPK pathway, making the body think it's hungry even when it might not be, and it also helps keep blood sugar levels steady. However, metformin can sometimes cause stomach discomfort, which reduces appetite for some people, including myself. This side effect, though, is relatively well known because metformin has been used by millions of people for decades. So, metformin creates a sense of hunger at the cellular level, and from a hormesis perspective, this slight stress can be beneficial, right? Exactly. Metformin helps the body respond to this stress by boosting energy supply. It undeniably increases the number of mitochondria, making cells more efficient at generating energy. However, in the short term, metformin can actually poison part of the mitochondria, which seems counterintuitive but leads to benefits over time. What part of the mitochondria is affected? The part called complex I. Complex I is involved in creating a proton gradient across the mitochondrial membrane. When protons build up, they create an acidic environment. To release these protons, the cell opens pores between the membranes. As protons pass through these pores, they spin a protein that generates chemical energy in the form of ATP. ATP is crucial for cellular functions. Without it, we'd be dead in about 10 seconds. The slight poisoning caused by metformin decreases ATP production temporarily, which forces the cell to create more mitochondria to compensate. So, the increase in mitochondrial number is a response to this temporary poisoning. Additionally, metformin helps the body become more sensitive to insulin, which helps keep glucose levels steady. This is particularly beneficial for people with type 2 diabetes, as it helps manage and prevent worsening of the disease. There's another important point. Recent discoveries suggest that taking metformin in conjunction with exercise can blunt the exercise-induced increase in mitochondria. This is because constant presence of metformin might limit the body's ability to fully benefit from exercise-induced mitochondrial growth. Therefore, it might be better to alternate between taking metformin and exercising. For example, you could take metformin on days when you're not exercising and use exercise days for recovery. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not prescribing anything, but based on my experience and current understanding, I take metformin in a pulsed manner. I exercise about 4 hours on the weekends with my son. My routine includes an hour with my trainer, another hour with my son doing various activities, and then some yoga. I also enjoy using the sauna, hot tub, and cold bath in succession, which I find very rejuvenating. In terms of cold exposure and heat, both are beneficial. Cold exposure, such as cryotherapy, builds up brown fat, which is metabolically active and has a lot of mitochondria. Brown fat can help keep you lean by burning energy and secreting proteins that promote overall health. The metabolic winter hypothesis suggests that our modern lifestyles, where we are rarely exposed to cold, might contribute to health issues like diabetes. For practical advice, if you don't have access to a sauna or cold bath at home, you could mimic the benefits by exposing yourself to these conditions occasionally. For example, spend about an hour on Sundays in a sauna at around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by time in a steam room, and then alternate between a hot tub and a cold bath. Lastly, regarding level 3, resetting the biological clock is a more complex process. Recent research, including work by Shinya Yamanaka, has shown that specific genes can reset age. By introducing these genes into cells, researchers have been able to revert the cells to a more youthful state. This process has been successfully applied to various species, indicating that the instructions to be young are still present in our cells. However, if this process is not controlled properly, it could lead to the development of tumors because cells that revert too far to a stem cell-like state can become uncontrollable. Okay, so why do I become a tumor? Because a tumor is a cell that doesn't know to stop, right? So what is it that you are breaking in that process that makes it so dysfunctional? Yeah, so in terms of the clock, let's just start with that. Shinya Yamanaka wound the clock so far back it went back to zero, back to midnight. We do not want to do that because the cells lose their identity, and that's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to go back to us because it's dangerous to have a pluripotent stem cell in the wrong place in the body. Of course, it'll grow, it won't stop growing. But why does it become a tumor? Why doesn't it become a liver or a lung? Like, I would get the problem of having a liver develop in my brain, but I'm just saying, why does it become a tumor cell instead of an actual functioning liver? Well, so when you go back far enough and it loses its identity, it will just multiply into a mass without cellular identity. So there's something else going on that stops it from figuring itself out, right? So in the lab, if we take a pluripotent stem cell and we want to make a liver cell or a neuron, a nerve cell, we give it a bunch of chemical signals in what we call the niche. And when one of these cells lands in a niche around those old cells, they'll use that stem cell to rebuild tissue. But imagine if we could reset the clock, not all the way back to a stem cell, but just partially reset the clock so that you could go back to being 20 again, right? That's what we are able to do in some tissues in the mouse right now. You do it en masse when it's cell by cell, DNA strand by DNA strand. Like, how the hell do you get this to take effect through a whole joint, let alone the whole body? Yeah, right now, the way we do it is we inject a virus called an AAV, and this virus will target certain tissues and deliver the genes to most of the cells in that tissue. For example, we are treating aging of the eye in mice. So we can take an old mouse, we deliver a virus, the AAV, into the eye, a tiny little prick. It's the same virus that's used to correct genetic deficiencies in the eye, right now FDA-approved drugs. So this isn't science fiction, this is out there in the world right now. We give it to the old mice, we give them an antibiotic called doxycycline. Okay, same thing you might take if you got Lyme disease, and that turns on these reprogramming factors. We don't use all 4 of the factors, OSKM they're called, because one of them causes cancer. The M, we leave off. The M, we put OSNK into the eye, turn it on, leave it for a few weeks, measure what happens to the eye, and those mice can see again like they were young. So we've tested 3 different types of damage to the eye. The first one we did was a Hail Mary. A lab near ours, across the road, works on rejuvenating the spine and the optic nerve, which is crazy. Yeah, because we know as soon as you're, a couple of months old, you're not going to regrow a spine. It's one of the first parts of the body that ages, in fact. But jellyfish can regrow, axolotls can regrow an arm. We lose that ability when we are very, very young. So the question was, if we turn the clock back a lot without OSK genes, will those nerve cells be young enough to regrow back to the brain if we damage them? And that was the experiment. They pinched the back of the optic nerve so that the nerves were defective, and they started to die back towards the brain. Of course, the mice lost their vision. We then turned on our reprogramming factors. We now see that the nerves get young again, wind the clock back, and they regrow back to the brain. We could give ourselves the healing ability that we only had when we were embryos, and you start to think about what could this lead to? If we can do this safely, of course, safe is the important word, across the body, imagine one day you could have every cell in your body able to be rejuvenated like that. You cut yourself, you break a bone, you lose your mind, you have dementia, you take a course of doxycycline for a few weeks, and then stop, switch it off again, and you heal. If you turn it on at high levels, there's a lab in Spain that has shown that you can get small tumors in some animals in the kidney. So we've been very careful to not just blast the cell with these factors permanently. We've titrated, or we say brought the levels down to very low levels, and switched it off when we don't need it. But we have given mice this virus throughout their body. We inject it into a vein, and we turn it on. We've left it on, now expecting the mice to die a year later. They're perfectly fine. Wow! So it appears to be safe, but of course, there's a lot more work to do. I'm a scientist, and I'm developing drugs. I have to be very aware of the dangers. Sure. Please, nobody go out and try this at home at all until we know more. But the eye is a good testing zone because it's protected, and if there's a problem, it's shielded from the rest of the body, it won't go too far. But everything we know now is that it seems to be very safe, at least in the eye. Wow, this is crazy. So, is there an element of getting better, improvement, human performance, or anything that you can tease us with? Well, we've actually published results that in mice, if you give them a nut booster molecule that will turn on these Pacman enzymes called the sirtuins, those mice, when they're old, can now run 50% further. In fact, some of our old mice ran so far that the treadmill stopped because mice are not supposed to run more than 3 kilometers. We haven't talked about NAD yet. Tell me what NAD is, what are the precursors, how do I supplement for it? So, there are a few on the market. I don't endorse or sell anything, just by the way, even if you see me online, that's not me. So that said, there's one called NR, which stands for nicotinamide riboside, which is a very early precursor to making NAD in the body. There's an intermediate from that called NMN, not to be confused with M&MS, please don't do that, that's not healthy. And then the cell turns NMN into NAD, and you can take all three, actually, or each one of those three, and raise NAD levels in animals. And now we are doing, myself and many others, are doing human studies, and we've seen that NR and, in my case, NMN does raise the energy levels of older people and young people alike up to levels that we think you could rarely achieve even with being a marathon runner. That's crazy. So just to bring this home for people, talk to me about your dad and his N-of-1 experimentation with NMN. Yeah, so my father has been on the same regimen as me, resveratrol, for over a decade, the red wine molecule. He's been on metformin longer than me because he was a borderline diabetic, type 2 diabetic, and he's also on NMN now, and he seems to be doing great. He's now 80. When he was in his 70s he was slowing down, he was starting to say the same things twice, you know, typical 70-year-old. He's doing great now. He's 80, he's got a new lease on life. He started a new career down in Sydney. He's hiking all over the world right now. He's traveling around America, driving his elderly friend around. His friend, unfortunately, ended up going to the hospital the last few days, so my father is taking care of his friend, who he's seeing on the decline, and he's, if anything, improving every year. I'd love to hear more about resveratrol, which is something that I've completely written off until I started researching you. It seemed for a red-hot minute like it was real, and then it seemed to completely die. And I know that you got sort of caught in the middle of some of this stuff. So where has all the, forget like what pop culture thinks of it, like what's the reality of it? Yeah, so resveratrol was a proof-of-concept molecule back in 2003, the first of its kind, that could mimic caloric restriction, make mice healthy on a high-fat Western diet. And it was a great proof of something that we were trying to figure out, and it led to drugs that went into humans that looked really promising. I got embroiled in a scientific and a corporate war song. In the case of Pfizer, they put out a scientific paper that said essentially everything that David has said is wrong. Okay, and then that was a great headline. Harvard scientists started companies, is wrong. Okay. And, you know, and then I spent about a week in bed saying, F*** the world. You know, why am I doing this? Why am I working so hard for society if they don't care? But I worked my way out of bed. I thought, let's dig deep and see if they're right or if we are right. And so for another 3 years, we really worked hard in my lab at Harvard to test whether we were right. So the question was, with this Pac-Man that spools the DNA, does it actually make a difference? Those are the main things that I think are helpful. And I've been monitoring my blood biochemistry. And you said you took an MRI of your heart, right? Which I love. What are things that we should be testing? Assume, for a second, I'm willing to go all the way, do any crazy test to know if what I'm doing is working. What would you recommend? Well, I avoid X-rays and CT scans unless I have to. Sure, if your doctor says go for it, please don't refuse that. But otherwise, don't do it for fun, don't do it because you are curious. Those CT scans will break your DNA, and when we break the mouse's DNA, its age goes up by 50%. Whoa! Right, so avoid DNA breaks as much as possible. What I do is I take a blood test from a company called Inside Tracker, which, in full disclosure, I invested in years ago. They look at about 30 parameters in your blood and give you feedback. It's doctor supervised, so it's legit, and it's based on a lot of science. And that at least gives you some feedback about your body, about what's actually happening if you change your lifestyle or you take a supplement, or even a new drug, for that matter. So, you've got to be monitoring because you don't want to fly blind. You don't know if, for you, you are doing harm or doing good. So do a blood test at least. Go to your doctor and have a blood test, for goodness sake. You could have your genome sequenced or do something that looks at the variants in your genome for relatively little cost. I think it's $99 now. I gave a test of that kind to my whole family as a Christmas present, and what we've learned is that some of our family members have variants that predict longevity, some don't. Some have mutations in their genome that are a little bit scary. Down the line, you could get your DNA methylation age determined, the true what's called the Horvath clock. Some people measure their telomere lengths. Well, that's easy. Since I was 4 years old, I've wanted to figure out why we die so fast. And, in my view, I think it's cruel to have a sentient being that knows it's going to die in such a short time frame. 80 years is nothing. It goes by in a blink of an eye. Even 1,000 years will go by in a blink, it's only 20 times what I've lived. So I want to be able to leave a mark on the planet. I'm hoping to have moved the needle somewhat on the course of human history. I think we've come further than I thought we would in my whole lifetime, and I've still got a few years left to try and make what I'm talking about come true. I certainly hope so. If you were going to have people make one change that would have the biggest impact on their health, what change would you have them make? Well, having read tens of thousands of papers and done this for now 30 years, and talked to people, and I know what's on the cutting edge, the simplest thing you can do that would have the biggest bang for the buck is be a little bit hungry. Don't eat, but that's not to say be malnourished. Don't starve yourself. There are a lot of teenage girls, particularly, who don't eat enough. So I'm not saying that at all. You've got to have a minimum nutrition. But for those of us, myself included, who like to eat, those of us who don't mind a bit of dessert, try to skip a meal. I skip breakfast, besides that bit of yogurt. Often I'm too busy to eat. I eat lunch and dinner. I eat a normal meal. I don't gorge myself because that'll trigger all these defensive pathways that'll rebuild the body or at least keep it pristine until we have such things as the level 3 reversal, which we are now working on. That's amazing, David. Thank you so much for being here. That's incredible. And guys, read the book, dive in. If you are like me and you want to live forever, I'm telling you this guy is at the tip of a very exciting sphere. So check him out if you haven't already. Be sure to subscribe, and until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care, my man. That was awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching and being a part of this community. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. You are going to get weekly videos on building a growth mindset, cultivating grit, and unlocking your full potential.